while others filmed with their phones. A 13-year-old black boy risked his life for a disabled stranger. When the man discovered where the boy lived, his reaction made the whole neighborhood freeze. The rumble of the 6:15 a.m. train shook the thin walls of apartment 3B, rattling the single photo frame on Tyrell Johnson's bedside table. The 13-year-old's eyes snapped open, his long fingers automatically reaching to silence his phone alarm before it could wake his mother. He sat up in bed, his lanky frame casting a shadow in the dim morning light. Through the cracked bedroom door, he could see his mother, Sandra, still in her blue hospital scrubs, passed out on their worn beige couch. Her second shift at the memorial had ended just 2 hours ago. "Mom?" Tyrell whispered, patting across the cold linoleum floor. No response. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and her work shoes were still on her feet. He grabbed the throw blanket from the back of the couch and covered her gently. In the kitchen, Tyrell opened the refrigerator, its light flickering weakly. Empty except for half a carton of milk and some leftover Chinese takeout from 3 days ago. He checked the cabinets next, one package of instant ramen and a nearly empty box of cereal. "Great," he muttered, grabbing a pen and the grocery list notepad they kept on the counter. His handwriting was neat, practiced. "Don't worry about groceries, Mom. I'll figure something out after school. Get some rest." The memory hit him as he got dressed, sharp and sudden like always. He was 5 years old, sitting on these same steps, watching his father load a duffel bag into his car. "Just going to the store," he'd said. That was 8 years ago. Tyrell shouldered his backpack, heavy with borrowed library books, and locked the apartment door behind him. The hallway smelled like somebody's burnt coffee, and Mrs. Rodriguez from 3A was already arguing with someone on her phone in rapid Spanish. The walk to Bronx Public School 121 took exactly 18 minutes. Tyrell had timed it. He kept his head down as he passed the corner where the older kids usually hung out, though they weren't there this early. "Well, if it isn't my favorite early bird," Ms. Chun, the school librarian, said when he pushed open the library doors at 7:30 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she sorted through a cart of returns. "You're here even earlier than usual. Mom had a double shift," Tyrell explained, dropping his backpack at his usual table near the reference section. His stomach growled loudly. Ms. Chin frowned. "Did you eat breakfast?" "Yeah," he lied, pulling out his math textbook. "Course I did." She disappeared into her office and came back with a granola bar. "Found this in my desk. Can't remember when I bought it, so you'd better take it off my hands." Tyrell's pride warred briefly with his hunger. Hunger won. "Thanks, Miss Chun." The morning dragged through pre-algebra and American history. By lunch period, the granola bar was a distant memory. Tyrell sat alone at his usual cafeteria table, algebra homework spread out before him instead of a lunch tray. Around him, other kids laughed and talked, trading snacks and sharing stories about their weekends. Marcus Wright, whose dad owned a successful bodega on 167th Street, was telling anyone who'd listen about his new PlayStation 5. "You should come over and check it out," he told his friends. Nobody looked Tyrell's way. After the final bell, instead of heading home to an empty apartment, Tyrell walked the 6 blocks to the public library. The security guard, Mr. Pete, gave him a familiar nod as he passed through the metal detectors. He spent 3 hours at his favorite study table on the 2nd floor, working through his homework and getting ahead on next week's reading assignments. The library was quiet except for the soft clicking of computer keyboards and the occasional whispered conversation. At 6:30 p.m., as he was packing up his books, an unfamiliar feeling settled in his stomach. Usually, he took the direct route home down Webster Avenue. Today, something he couldn't say what made him consider taking the longer way through Manhattan. "Heading out, Mr. Pete," he called as he pushed through the heavy library doors into the cooling evening air. The guard waved goodbye. Tyrell stood on the library steps, looking first toward Webster Avenue, then in the direction of the Manhattan streets that gleamed in the distance. The strange feeling persisted. After a moment's hesitation, he turned left instead of right. He didn't know it yet, but that simple choice would change everything. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings as Tyrell began his walk, the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic growing louder with each step. Behind him, the familiar comfort of the Bronx faded into the gathering dusk, and ahead lay a part of the city that felt like another world entirely. The streets changed the further Tyrell walked. Cracked sidewalks became smooth concrete. Corner stores with barred windows transformed into boutiques with gleaming glass fronts. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished pavement. A woman in a business suit clutched her purse tighter as he passed. Tyrell pretended not to notice, but his shoulders tensed. He'd seen that reaction before. "Just keep walking," he muttered to himself, pushing his hands deeper into his pockets. The fabric of his jeans was wearing thin at the knees. A group of tourists blocked the sidewalk ahead, their phones raised to photograph a tall building. Tyrell stepped off the curb to go around them. Nobody moved to make space. "Excuse me," he said quietly, but his voice was lost in their excited chatter. As he squeezed past, one of them pulled their shopping bags closer. The sun had dropped lower now, casting golden light across the glass and steel towers. Tyrell's reflection flickered in the windows, tall and thin, wearing his faded blue t-shirt and the backpack he'd had since 6th grade. A police car cruised past slowly. The officer behind the wheel gave him a long look. Tyrell kept his face neutral, remembering what his mother had taught him. "Don't give them any reason, baby. Not a single reason." The intersection ahead was busy with evening traffic. Horns honked. Buses hissed. The walk signal flashed its countdown. 15, 14, 13. That's when Tyrell first saw him. The man sat in a wheelchair at the corner, wearing an expensive-looking navy suit. White hair, probably in his 70s. His wheels had gotten caught in a slight dip in the pavement. The man tried to push forward, but the chair wouldn't budge. The countdown continued. 8, 7, 6. A young woman in running gear jogged past, earbuds in. A businessman talking on his phone walked around the wheelchair without looking up. "Could someone dash?" the man started to say, but his voice was drowned out by a passing truck. The light changed. Cars began inching forward, drivers impatient after a long day. The man in the wheelchair was still stuck. Tyrell watched as more people walked past. A teenager raised his phone, starting to film. Others followed suit, their screens pointed at the scene, but their bodies staying firmly on the sidewalk. "Hey, check this out," someone said, elbowing their friend. More phones appeared. The man in the wheelchair tried again to move, his arms straining against the wheels. A car horn blared. The chair didn't move. Tyrell felt his heart speed up. The right thing to do was obvious, but his mother's voice echoed in his head. "Keep your head down. Stay out of trouble. The world ain't fair, but we gotta live in it." A taxi driver leaned on his horn. "Get out of the street," he yelled through his open window. The man in the wheelchair looked around, his expression a mixture of frustration and growing fear. His eyes met Tyrell's across the intersection. More cars honked. More phones recorded. Nobody moved to help. Tyrell's hands clenched into fists. His mother's warning competed with another memory. Her voice soft but firm as she dressed a patient's wounds during her hospital volunteer days. Sometimes doing nothing is the same as doing wrong. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown. Some people whispered to each other. Others just stared. A few laughed. But no one stepped forward. The man tried one more time to move his chair. The wheels spun uselessly. A bus turned the corner, its air brakes hissing like a warning. Tyrell felt sweat break out on his forehead. The smart thing would be to walk away, to stay out of it, to keep his head down like always. But his feet wouldn't move in that direction. Instead, he found himself taking a step toward the street. Then another. The taxi driver was still yelling. The phones were still recording. The bus was getting closer. Tyrell's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. His mother would be furious if she knew what he was about to do. But as he watched the man struggle, he remembered how it felt to need help and have nobody step forward. He remembered watching his mother fall asleep on the couch, exhausted from working 2 jobs, because there was nobody else to help carry the load. The crowd parted slightly as he moved through it. Someone whispered, "What's he doing?" Tyrell stepped off the curb. Behind him, he heard someone say, "Hey kid, don't dash," but he was already crossing the street, his worn sneakers carrying him toward the man in the wheelchair. Cars continued to honk. The bus driver hit his brakes. The evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and in those shadows, A 13-year-old boy from the Bronx walked toward a moment that would change his life forever. He didn't know that yet. All he knew was that someone needed help, and everyone else was just watching. The man in the wheelchair looked up as Tyrell approached. Their eyes met again, closer this time. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment, this simple, terrifying moment, would set in motion events that would transform both their lives. Tyrell took a deep breath and opened his mouth to speak. "Are you well, sir?" Tyrell's voice came out steadier than he expected. The man looked up at him, surprise clear on his lined face. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. "The wheel's stuck," he said, gesturing to where the chair had caught in an uneven spot in the pavement. "Can't seem to dash," a car horn blasted, making them both jump. The driver swerved around them, engine revving. "Watch it," someone yelled from the sidewalk. Tyrell's hands shook as he gripped the wheelchair's handles. "I'm going to try to push you, okay?" The man nodded. "What's your name, son?" "Tyrell." He pushed. The chair didn't move. His arms strained with effort, but the wheels remained firmly stuck. Traffic continued to flow around them like a river around rocks. More horns blared. Someone shouted from a car window, "Get out of the road!" The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger. Phones recorded. People whispered. The sun's glare reflected off dozens of screens. "It's caught on something," the man said. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests. "I'm Harrison. Robert Harrison." Tyrell tried again, pushing harder. The chair shifted slightly, but wouldn't roll forward. A bus rumbled past, too close, the rush of air making his t-shirt flutter. "Maybe we should wait for the police," Mr. Harrison suggested, his voice tight with worry. Another car swerved around them, its mirror missing Tyrell by inches. His heart hammered against his ribs. "No time," he said. He repositioned himself, planting his feet firmly. His worn sneakers slipped slightly on the smooth pavement. The evening sun cast their shadow long across the street. A boy and a man in a wheelchair, surrounded by moving traffic. "Where do you live?" Mr. Harrison asked suddenly. "What?" "Your address." "Where do you live?" Tyrell blinked, confused by the question. "Bronx. Webster Avenue." A taxi's brakes squealed nearby. The driver leaned out his window. "You're going to get somebody killed." The words hit Tyrell like a physical blow. He was 13 years old, standing in Manhattan traffic. His mother didn't even know where he was. What was he doing? His legs trembled. It would be so easy to walk away, to disappear back into the crowd, to let someone else handle this. But Mr. Harrison was looking at him with trust in his eyes. The kind of trust Tyrell wasn't used to seeing from strangers in expensive suits. "Son," Mr. Harrison said quietly, "if you need to go, I understand." A police siren wailed in the distance. More cars honked. The crowd murmured. Tyrell thought of his mother, probably still asleep on their couch. She'd taught him to keep his head down, to stay safe. But she'd also taught him something else, that doing the right thing wasn't always the same as doing the easy thing. He adjusted his grip on the wheelchair handles. "I'm not leaving." Mr. Harrison nodded, something like pride flickering across his face. Tyrell braced himself and pushed again, harder this time. His muscles burned. Sweat ran down his back. The chair moved an inch, then stopped. "Almost," Mr. Harrison encouraged. "It's starting to dash." A loud horn cut him off. A delivery truck was bearing down on them, its driver gesturing angrily. Time seemed to slow down. Tyrell saw everything with crystal clarity. The truck getting closer, the useless crowd with their phones, Mr. Harrison's hands gripping his armrests, the sun setting behind the tall buildings. In that moment, Tyrell made his choice. He dug deep, finding strength he didn't know he had. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "You're stronger than you think, baby." "Always have been." With a grunt of effort, he threw his whole body into one final push. The wheelchair's wheels caught for a moment, then suddenly broke free. The truck's horn blared again, closer now. Tyrell pushed forward, his sneakers scraping against the pavement. Mr. Harrison's wheelchair rolled, picking up speed. The truck driver slammed on his brakes. They reached the opposite curb, just as the truck whooshed past behind them. The wheelchair bumped up against the curb, stopping abruptly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Traffic continued to flow behind them. The crowd across the street was still filming. Tyrell's legs felt like jelly. His heart pounded in his ears. They'd made it. Mr. Harrison turned in his chair to look at him. Son, I don't know how to thank you. It's okay. Tyrell managed between deep breaths. Really? No, Mr. Harrison said firmly. It's not just okay. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a business card. Take this. Tyrell hesitated, then accepted the card. The paper was thick, expensive. The name, Robert Harrison, was printed in raised letters, followed by Harrison Investment Group, CEO. I want you to call that number tomorrow, Mr. Harrison said. His eyes were intense. Promise me. A police car's siren grew louder, getting closer. I should go, Tyrell said, suddenly nervous. He tucked the card into his jeans pocket. Remember, tomorrow, Mr. Harrison called after him as he turned to leave. Tyrell nodded, then merged into the dispersing crowd. His hands were still shaking. The business card felt heavy in his pocket. The walk home was a blur. His legs moved automatically, carrying him back toward the Bronx, back toward Webster Avenue, back toward his sleeping mother and their small apartment. But something had changed. He could feel it. As the familiar sight of his apartment building came into view, Tyrell touched the card in his pocket. Tomorrow, he thought. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't even imagine. Traffic roared around them like an angry river. Tyrell's muscles strained against the wheelchair's weight, his sneakers slipping on the smooth pavement. The crowd's phones glinted in the fading sunlight, recording every second of their struggle. It stuck again, Mr. Harrison said, his knuckles white on the armrests. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the cool evening air. A memory flashed through Tyrell's mind, his mother's voice from years ago. If something's worth doing, baby, it's worth doing right. No halfway measures. He'd been 5, trying to make his bed. The sheets were tangled, and he'd wanted to give up. Now, 8 years later, her words hit different. A car horn blasted. Get out of the road, someone yelled. We can't stay here, Tyrell said, adjusting his grip on the handles. His palms were sweaty, making them slip. Mr. Harrison tried to help, pushing his wheels forward, but they just spun uselessly. Son, maybe you should dash. I'm not leaving. Tyrell cut him off, surprising himself with his firmness. More cars swerved around them. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger. Someone shouted, Yo, this is crazy. Kid's gonna get himself killed. Tyrell's arms burned. The wheelchair felt heavier with each passing second. He could hear police sirens in the distance, getting closer. What's your mother's name? Mr. Harrison asked suddenly, his voice steady despite their situation. What? Your mother. What's her name? Sandra. Tyrell grunted, pushing again. The wheels caught on something. Sandra Johnson. She raised you right, Sandra Johnson's son, Mr. Harrison said. A taxi swerved past them, horn blaring. Tyrell's legs trembled with effort. She works 2 jobs. Nurse at Memorial. Must be proud of you. She doesn't know I'm here. Another push. The wheels moved an inch, then stuck again. She'd probably kill me if she knew. Mr. Harrison chuckled despite their situation. My Catherine would have said the same thing. My late wife, he added, seeing Tyrell's questioning look. She always said I had more courage than sense. A bus rumbled past, too close. The rush of air made Tyrell stumble. His foot slipped, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he'd fall into traffic. Careful! Mr. Harrison reached back, grabbing Tyrell's wrist to steady him. His grip was surprisingly strong. The sirens were closer now. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance. We need to move, Tyrell said. His heart pounded against his ribs. Before they get here, Mr. Harrison nodded. Together then. On 3. Tyrell repositioned himself, planting his feet firmly. 1. Mr. Harrison counted. A car horn blasted. 2. The crowd's phones recorded. 3. They moved together, Tyrell pushing, Mr. Harrison turning his wheels. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a jolt, the wheelchair rolled forward. That's it, Mr. Harrison encouraged. They made it another few feet before the wheels caught again. Tyrell's arms felt like lead. You can do this, son, Mr. Harrison said. Just like your mother taught you. No halfway measures. The sirens were only blocks away now. Tyrell closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. He thought of his mother, probably still asleep on their couch. What would she say if she could see him now? He opened his eyes. Ready? Mr. Harrison nodded. They tried again. The wheelchair moved. Stopped. Moved again. A delivery truck laid on its horn, the sound deafening. Its driver was gesturing wildly through the windshield. Look out! Someone shouted from the crowd. The truck wasn't stopping. Tyrell's world narrowed to a single focus. Move forward or get hit. He dug deep, finding strength he didn't know he had. His mother's voice echoed in his head. You're stronger than you think, baby. Always have been. With a grunt that came from somewhere deep in his chest, Tyrell pushed. The wheelchair's wheels screamed against the pavement. The truck's brakes squealed. They moved. Inch by inch, foot by foot, they fought their way across the street. Tyrell's muscles burned. Sweat ran into his eyes. But he didn't stop. The truck missed them by inches, its rush of air hitting them like a physical wave. Almost there, Mr. Harrison encouraged. Almost. The curb loomed ahead, their final obstacle. Tyrell gathered his remaining strength. One last push. The wheelchair's front wheels hit the curb. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge. Then, with a final surge of effort, they were up and over. Safe. Tyrell's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the curb, his whole body shaking. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Sandra Johnson's son, Mr. Harrison said, turning his chair to face Tyrell. You did it? Tyrell couldn't speak. His lungs burned. His arms felt like rubber. The police sirens were very close now. Mr. Harrison reached into his jacket. Before you go dash. I should dash. Tyrell started to stand. Wait. Mr. Harrison's voice was firm. He pulled out a business card. Take this. Call me tomorrow. Tyrell hesitated, then took the card. The paper was thick, expensive. Tomorrow, Mr. Harrison repeated. Promise me? The police car turned the corner. Tyrell nodded, tucked the card in his pocket, and disappeared into the dispersing crowd. His legs carried him automatically toward home, toward the Bronx, toward his mother, who still didn't know where he was. The business card felt heavy in his pocket. Each step took him farther from Manhattan, from Mr. Harrison, from what he'd just done. But something had changed. He could feel it in his trembling muscles, in his racing heart, in the weight of the card against his leg. Tomorrow, he thought. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't even imagine. The sun had set completely by the time he reached their apartment building. The stairs seemed longer than usual, his legs still shaky from the effort. He found his key, opened their door quietly in case his mother was still sleeping. She wasn't. Sandra Johnson sat on their worn couch, still in her hospital scrubs, very much awake. Tyrell James Johnson, she said, her voice deadly quiet. Where have you been? The business card felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. Tomorrow was going to come sooner than he thought. Mom, I can explain, Tyrell said, his hand instinctively touching the business card in his pocket. Sandra Johnson stood up from the couch, her hospital scrubs wrinkled from sleep. Do you know what time it is? I wake up. You're not here. No dash. I left a note, Tyrell interrupted. On the kitchen counter? About groceries. Her voice cracked. Not about where you were going. I called Ms. Chan at the library. She said you left hours ago. The apartment felt smaller than usual. A train rumbled past their window, making the glass rattle. I took a different way home, Tyrell said. His arms still ached from pushing the wheelchair. A different way? Through where? He swallowed. Manhattan? His mother's eyes widened. Manhattan? What possessed you to dash? There was this man, Tyrell started. In a wheelchair. He needed help. Sandra sank back onto the couch. What kind of help? Tyrell told her everything. The stuck wheelchair. The traffic. The crowd with their phones. His voice shook when he described the truck that almost hit them. His mother's face went pale. You could have been killed. I couldn't just leave him there. Baby, that's what the police are for. What emergency services are for. Nobody was helping him, Mom. They were just watching. Recording on their phones. Sandra pressed her fingers to her temples. And this man, he gave you his card? Tyrell pulled out Mr. Harrison's business card. His mother took it, squinting at the raised lettering. Harrison Investment Group? She looked up sharply. CEO. He wants me to call tomorrow. Why? I don't know. Tyrell sat next to her on the couch. He just made me promise. Sandra studied the card. Her hands were shaking slightly. You know what could have happened today? If that truck hadn't stopped? If any of those cars dash, I know, Mom. Do you? She turned to face him. Every day I go to work at that hospital. I see what happens when things go wrong. When people get hit by cars. When they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. But nothing happened, Tyrell said quietly. This time, she set the card on their coffee table. This time, nothing happened. But baby, we can't afford to take chances. Not in this world. Not people like us. The words hung in the air between them. Tyrell thought about how the crowd had stared. How some had laughed. How no one had stepped forward to help until he did. He said, "You raised me right," Tyrell said softly. Sandra's breath caught. What? Mr. Harrison. When I was helping him, he said, "You raised me right." His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. She smelled like hospital antiseptic, and the coffee she practically lived on between shifts. "You could have died today," she whispered into his hair. "I'm sorry I scared you." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "You did what I would have done. That's what scares me most." The business card sat between them on the coffee table, its gold lettering catching the light. "Should I call him?" Tyrell asked. Sandra picked up the card again, running her thumb over the embossed letters. "Robert Harrison," she read aloud. "You say he was alone? No nurse? No caretaker? Just him, in this expensive suit, stuck in the middle of traffic." His mother frowned. "And he asked for our address? And your name?" She set the card down again. "I don't like it, Mom dash, but," she continued, "we raise you to finish what you start. If you made him a promise." Tyrell sat up straighter. "So I can call? Tomorrow." She pointed at the clock. "After school. And I'll be here when you do." A knock at their door made them both jump. Sandra stood, automatically positioning herself between Tyrell and the door. Who dash another knock, firmer this time. Through the thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Rodriguez from 3A opening her door. "Queen-S? Who's out there?" A man's voice responded, cultured and polite. "I'm looking for Tyrell Johnson." Tyrell recognized the voice. His mother must have seen it on his face. "Mr. Harrison?" she mouthed silently. Tyrell nodded. Another knock. Sandra straightened her scrubs, squared her shoulders. "Tomorrow just came early," she said, and moved to open the door. On their welcome mat stood Robert Harrison in his wheelchair, flanked by a tall man in a dark suit. Behind them, every neighbor on their floor had their door cracked open, watching. "Mrs. Johnson?" Mr. Harrison's smile was warm. "Your son saved my life today. May we come in?" Sandra's hand tightened on the doorknob. She looked back at Tyrell, then at the man who had followed them home. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Sandra Johnson, who had taught her son to keep his head down and stay out of trouble, opened their door wider. "Come in," she said. "We have some things to discuss." Their small living room had never felt more cramped. Mr. Harrison's wheelchair barely fit between the coffee table and the worn couch. The tall man in the dark suit stood by the door, silent and watchful. "James," Mr. Harrison said to him, "wait outside, please." The tall man hesitated, then nodded and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Sandra perched on the edge of the couch, still in her wrinkled scrubs. "Can I offer you something to drink, Mr. Harrison?" "Robert, please." He smiled. "And no, thank you. I won't take much of your time. I know you must be tired from your hospital shift." Tyrell sat next to his mother, watching the exchange. His arms still ached from earlier. "How did you find us?" Sandra asked. "I have resources," Mr. Harrison said simply. "And your son told me Webster Avenue." A train rattled past their window. Through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbors trying to listen in. "About today," Sandra started. "Your son showed extraordinary courage," Mr. Harrison interrupted. When dozens of adults stood by with their phones, a 13-year-old boy risked his life to help a stranger. "He could have been killed," Sandra said quietly. "Yes." Mr. Harrison's face grew serious. "I've thought about that every minute since it happened, which is why I'm here." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Mrs. Johnson dash. If that's a check," Sandra said firmly, "we can't accept it." "Mom," Tyrell whispered, It's not a check. Mr. Harrison held out the envelope. Please. Sandra took it, her hands slightly unsteady. She opened it carefully and pulled out several papers. What is this? She asked, scanning the first page. An opportunity, Mr. Harrison said. For Tyrell. Sandra's eyes widened as she read. Riverside Preparatory Academy? Tyrell sat up straighter. Everyone knew about Riverside Prep. It was one of the most exclusive private schools in Manhattan. Full scholarship, Mr. Harrison said, including books, uniforms, meals, and transportation. Why? Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. Because talent and character shouldn't be limited by zip code. Mr. Harrison looked at Tyrell. Your son has both in abundance. Sandra set the papers down. Mr. Harrison dash, Robert. She took a deep breath. This is very generous. But we can't dash, Mrs. Johnson. He interrupted gently. Sandra, may I tell you about my wife? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Your wife? Catherine. Mr. Harrison's eyes grew distant. She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. But before that, she was a teacher. Inner-city schools. She believed education could change lives. That one opportunity could reshape a child's entire future. He gestured at the papers. This isn't charity. It's investment in potential. The same kind of investment Catherine made every day of her teaching career. Sandra picked up the papers again, reading more carefully. There's more, Mr. Harrison said. He pulled another envelope from his jacket. This one is a check. Sandra started to protest, but he held up his hand. Not for you. For the hospital where you work. A donation to establish a scholarship fund for nurses wanting to advance their education. In your name. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic. Why? Sandra asked again. Because you raised a son who would risk his life to help a stranger. Mr. Harrison smiled. That didn't happen by accident. Tyrell watched his mother's face, seeing the emotions play across it. Pride, fear, hope, uncertainty. The school year starts in 3 weeks, Mr. Harrison continued. The uniform shop has been notified. Everything is arranged. All you have to do is say yes. Sandra looked at her son. Tyrell, what do you think? He thought about the library where he spent his afternoons. About Marcus Wright and his PlayStation 5. About the crowd with their phones, watching and recording, but never helping. I want to try, he said quietly. Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly. Sandra studied the papers again. The transportation, she asked. A car will pick him up each morning and return him each afternoon. The other students will be lucky to have him as a classmate. Sandra set the papers down and stood up. She walked to their small window, looking out at the street below. My mother cleaned houses, she said suddenly. Worked herself to the bone so I could go to nursing school. Said education was the only ladder long enough to climb out of where we were. She turned back to face them. Now I work 2 jobs so my son can have better than I did. And you've done remarkably, Mr. Harrison said. Let me help you take the next step. Sandra looked at Tyrell again. Baby, you sure about this? He nodded. She took a deep breath. Where do we sign? Mr. Harrison's face broke into a wide smile. He pulled out a pen. 10 minutes later, it was done. Tyrell Johnson would start at Riverside Preparatory Academy when the new term began. My driver will bring the uniform packages tomorrow, Mr. Harrison said as he moved his wheelchair toward the door. And Tyrell? Yes, sir? I'll be checking your progress personally. His eyes twinkled. No pressure. After they left, Sandra and Tyrell sat in silence, staring at the papers on their coffee table. Mom? Tyrell finally said. Are you okay? She pulled him into a tight hug. Baby, I am so proud of you. And so scared for you. And so proud again. Through their window, they heard a car start up. Probably Mr. Harrison's driver. Everything's going to change, Tyrell said. His mother kissed the top of his head. It already has, baby. It already has. Outside their building, a sleek black Mercedes pulled away from the curb, carrying Robert Harrison back to his world of investment firms and private schools. But he left behind something more valuable than money, opportunity. In an apartment 3B, a 13-year-old boy and his mother sat together on their worn couch, holding onto each other, facing a future that had suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of Webster Avenue. The knock came at 7 a.m. sharp. Tyrell was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the Riverside Prep papers spread across his desk. Sandra opened the door to find James, Mr. Harrison's driver, holding several garment bags. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," he said formally. "These are Tyrell's uniforms." The entire floor watched through cracked doors as James carried the bags into the Johnsons' apartment. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3A didn't even pretend not to stare. "There's a car waiting downstairs," James said, laying the bags across their couch. "Mr. Harrison would like to give Tyrell a tour of the school, if that's convenient." Sandra glanced at her son. "Now?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Harrison is in the car." Tyrell's stomach churned. He was still in his pajamas, an old t-shirt and basketball shorts. "Give us 10 minutes, Sandra said. James nodded. "Of course." After he left, Sandra unzipped one of the garment bags. Inside was a crisp navy blazer with the Riverside Prep crest, gray slacks, white shirts, and striped ties. "Mom," Tyrell said, touching the fabric. "This is real. Get dressed," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Your regular clothes. We shouldn't keep them waiting." 9 minutes later, they walked out of their building. A black Mercedes sat at the curb, drawing stares from everyone on the street. James stood by the back door, opening it as they approached. Mr. Harrison sat inside, smiling. "Good morning, Johnsons." The car's interior smelled like leather. Tyrell sank into the soft seat, trying not to stare at the built-in screens and mini fridge. "I hope you don't mind the early start," Mr. Harrison said as James pulled away from the curb. "The headmaster made time to meet us before classes begin." Sandra straightened her shirt. She'd changed out of her scrubs into her nicest blouse. "We appreciate this, Mr. Harrison." "Robert, please." He pressed a button, and a privacy screen rose between them and James. "There's something we need to discuss before we arrive." Tyrell's stomach tightened. "The other students," Mr. Harrison continued, "they come from privileged backgrounds. Some may not be welcoming at first." "Because we're poor?" Tyrell asked bluntly. "Tyrell," his mother warned. "No, he's right to ask." Mr. Harrison leaned forward. "Some will judge you for your background, yes. Others for the color of your skin. It's not right, but it's reality." Sandra took Tyrell's hand. "But," Mr. Harrison continued, "you've already shown more character than most of them will develop in a lifetime. Remember that." The car turned onto a tree-lined street. Ahead, granite buildings rose behind iron gates. "Riverside Prep," Mr. Harrison announced as they pulled up to the entrance. A security guard stepped out of his booth, then did a double-take when he saw Mr. Harrison through the window. The gates swung open immediately. They drove up a circular driveway to the main entrance. Stone steps led up to massive wooden doors. The lawn was perfectly manicured. James opened the car door. Sandra squeezed Tyrell's hand before letting go. At the top of the steps stood a tall woman in a gray suit. Her hair was pulled back severely, but her smile seemed genuine. "Robert," she called as they approached. "Right on time." "Helen," Mr. Harrison replied. "May I present Tyrell Johnson and his mother Sandra." "Mrs. Johnson." The woman shook Sandra's hand. "I'm Dr. Helen Porter, headmaster of Riverside Preparatory Academy." She turned to Tyrell. "And you must be our newest student." Tyrell nodded, suddenly unable to speak. "Come inside," Dr. Porter said. "Let's show you around your new school." The entrance hall was bigger than their entire apartment. Portraits of stern-looking men lined the walls. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor. "We have 20 students per class," Dr. Porter explained as they walked. "Every graduate goes on to a top-tier university. Harvard, Yale, Princeton." She led them past classrooms with smart boards and leather chairs. Past a library that made Tyrell's public branch look tiny. Past science labs with equipment he'd only seen in movies. "The cafeteria," Dr. Porter said, opening another door. Tables of polished wood gleamed under chandeliers. "All meals are included, of course." Sandra's grip on Tyrell's shoulder tightened slightly. They saw the music room with its baby grand piano. The art studio with its wall of windows. The Olympic-sized swimming pool. "And here," Dr. Porter said finally, "is your classroom. Room 214. Through the window, Tyrell could see empty desks arranged in a semicircle. A skeleton stood in one corner. Mathematical formulas covered one wall. Questions? Dr. Porter asked. Tyrell had 1,000, but couldn't voice any of them. The uniform, Sandra said. When should he start wearing it? First day of term, Dr. Porter replied. August 28th. The car will pick him up at 7:15 a.m. It was really happening. Mr. Harrison speaks very highly of you, Dr. Porter said to Tyrell. I look forward to seeing you prove him right. They walked back to the entrance. Other staff members had arrived, giving them curious looks as they passed. One last thing, Dr. Porter said at the door. She handed Sandra a thick envelope. The welcome packet, schedule, rules, required reading list. Back in the car, Tyrell finally found his voice. Mom? I know, baby. She was looking through the packet. I know. Mr. Harrison watched them with a small smile. Overwhelming, isn't it? A little, Tyrell admitted. Good. That means you understand the opportunity. Mr. Harrison's face grew serious. Some will say you don't belong there. Prove them wrong. The car pulled up to their building. Their neighbors were still watching from windows. Thank you, Sandra said to Mr. Harrison. For everything. He nodded. Thank you for raising a son brave enough to help a stranger. Inside their apartment, Sandra spread the welcome packet across their coffee table. Schedule, book list, dress code, parent handbook. Mom? Tyrell said again. Yes, baby. I'm scared. She pulled him close. Me too. But you know what? Being scared means you understand how important this is. He looked at the Riverside Prep crest on the papers. What if they hate me? Then you remember who you are. She turned him to face her. You're the boy who stopped to help when no one else would. You're my son, and you belong anywhere you're brave enough to go. A train rumbled past their window, but for the first time, Tyrell barely noticed it. His mind was already in room 214, at the empty desk that would soon be his. Everything was about to change, but maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what needed to happen. Miss Chun, can I talk to you for a minute? The school librarian looked up from her computer. It was Tyrell's last day at Bronx Public School 121, and the library was empty except for them. Of course. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Everything okay? Tyrell sat down, fidgeting with the envelope in his hands. I'm leaving. Transferring schools? I heard. Ms. Chin smiled. Riverside Prep, right? The whole school's talking about it. Yeah. He placed the envelope on her desk. I wanted to return all my library books. And say thank you. For what? The granola bars. Letting me study here early. Everything. Ms. Chin's eyes softened. You were always my favorite early bird. The library door opened, and Marcus Wright stuck his head in. Yo, Johnson. For real about that rich dude in the wheelchair. Word had spread fast after Mr. Harrison's visit. The story grew with each telling. Now some kids were saying Tyrell had fought off gangsters to save a millionaire. He just needed help, Tyrell said quietly. That's all? Marcus shook his head. Man, wait till I tell everyone in my new school. I got classes with a straight-up hero. Tyrell blinked. Your new school? Yeah, my dad's sending me to Bronx Science. Got it on the test. Marcus grinned. Guess we're both moving up? Huh? After Marcus left, Miss Chun started checking in Tyrell's return books. You know what I think? What? Some people wait their whole lives for a chance to prove who they are. You got yours at 13. Back home, Sandra was on the phone with Memorial Hospital. Yes, I understand it's short notice. No, I'm not quitting. I'm just reducing to one shift. Because I can now. My son needs me home more. She hung up and looked at the scholarship fund papers Mr. Harrison had sent over. The hospital's board had been shocked by the size of the donation. They're naming it after you, Tyrell said from the couch, where he was reading his Riverside Prep welcome packet. The Sandra Johnson Nursing Education Fund. Still doesn't feel real. She sat next to him. None of this does. A knock at the door made them both jump. It had happened a lot since Mr. Harrison's visit. Neighbors stopping by with congratulations, questions, and barely hidden envy. But this time it was James, Mr. Harrison's driver. Mrs. Johnson. He nodded politely. Mr. Harrison asked me to deliver these. He handed her a stack of papers. Legal documents. What's this? Sandra asked. The paperwork establishing a college fund for Tyrell. Mr. Harrison insists it's non-negotiable. After James left, they sat in silence. staring at the papers. "Mom," Tyrell finally said, "are we allowed to be this lucky?" She pulled him close. "This isn't luck, baby. This is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You prepared your whole life for that moment, studying hard, staying focused, building character. Then opportunity came, and you were ready." The next morning, Mr. Harrison himself arrived with more news. "I've arranged for tutoring," he said, sitting in their living room, 3 times a week after school, to help you catch up in any subjects where Riverside's curriculum differs from your current school. "That's not necessary," Sandra started. "It is." Mr. Harrison's voice was firm. "I'm investing in Tyrell's success, not setting him up to struggle." He turned to Tyrell. "The work will be harder than you're used to. The other students have had advantages you haven't, but you have something they don't." "What's that?" "The kind of strength that only comes from fighting uphill." Mr. Harrison smiled. "Use it." Later that day, Mrs. Rodriguez caught them in the hallway. "Mijo," she said to Tyrell, "my Eduardo. He sees you with those fancy uniforms, that nice car coming. He's asking questions about college now, about working harder in school." Sandra squeezed Tyrell's shoulder. "See? You're already making a difference." The weekend before school started, they hung his Riverside blazer in the closet. The blue fabric seemed to glow against his old clothes. "Nervous?" Sandra asked. "Yeah." Tyrell touched the school crest. "But like you said, that means I understand how important it is. Baby, look at me." She turned him to face her. "Some of those kids, they were born on third base thinking they hit a triple. You're starting from home plate. But you know what? What? You're the only one who's proven he can run the bases when it matters." That night, Tyrell couldn't sleep. He stood at his window, watching trains pass in the darkness. Everything was changing. His school, his mother's work schedule, their future. But something stayed the same. The trains still rattled their windows. Their apartment was still small. He was still Tyrell Johnson from Webster Avenue. The difference was, now he knew that wasn't all he could be. His phone buzzed, a text from Mr. Harrison. "Ready for Monday?" Tyrell looked at his blazer, hanging in the closet, at the study schedule the tutor had prepared, at the stack of new textbooks on his desk. He texted back, ready, because he was. Ready to cross the bridge between his old life and his new one. Ready to prove Mr. Harrison's faith in him wasn't misplaced. Ready to show that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like stopping to help when others walk away. In the distance, another train rumbled past. But for the first time in his life, Tyrell wasn't just watching it go by. He was going somewhere too. 1 month later, Tyrell stood at the same intersection where he'd first met Mr. Harrison. The crosswalk signal counted down. 15, 14, 13. "Different view from this side, isn't it?" Mr. Harrison said from beside him. Tyrell adjusted his Riverside prep blazer. "Yes, sir." They were heading back from his weekly progress meeting. For weeks into the school year, and Tyrell was maintaining straight A's. "Your algebra teacher says you're the best in class," Mr. Harrison mentioned. "Miss Chun, my old librarian, she used to help me get ahead." A businessman walked past, phone to his ear. He didn't look up. "You know," Mr. Harrison said, "I come this way every day now. Force of habit. Because of what happened. Because it reminds me that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as accidents." The light changed. They crossed together. Tyrell walking, Mr. Harrison wheeling himself easily over the now-repaired pavement. "How's your mother?" Mr. Harrison asked. "Better. She's sleeping more now that she's on single shift. The nursing fund is helping 3 people already. And the neighbors?" "Mrs. Rodriguez's son got into the gifted program. She says it's because of me. But dash, it is because of you." Mr. Harrison stopped his wheelchair. "You showed them something important." "What's that?" "That the distance between where you are and where you want to be is shorter than you think. Sometimes all it takes is 1 step. Or 1 push." The black Mercedes waited at the curb. James stood ready to help Mr. Harrison into the car. "Need a ride home?" Mr. Harrison asked. "No, sir. Meeting Mom at the library. She's taking computer classes there now." "Ah, yes." "For her nursing administration degree." They said goodbye, and Tyrell watched the Mercedes pull away. His phone buzzed, a text from Kevin, his new friend from Riverside. "Study group still on for tomorrow?" A year ago, Tyrell's only study partner had been himself. Now he had friends who debated Latin translations and argued about algebraic proofs. At the library, he found Sandra at a computer, frowning at a spreadsheet. "How was the meeting?" she asked, saving her work. "Good. Mr. Harrison says hi." "That man," she shook her head, smiling, "changed our whole lives because you stopped to help him?" "No," Tyrell said. "Changed our lives because you raised me to help him." Outside, the October sun was setting. They walked home together, Sandra telling him about her classes, Tyrell sharing stories about Riverside. "Some boy tried to make fun of my accent today," he mentioned. Sandra tensed. "What happened?" "Kevin. You remember Kevin? He stood up for me. Said anybody who judges someone's voice probably doesn't have anything worth saying." They passed the corner store where they used to buy dinner when money was tight. The owner waved. "You eat enough at school?" he called out. "They feed you good there?" "Yes, Mr. Lee," Tyrell answered. "The food's great." Good, good. "You study hard now." It was like that everywhere in the neighborhood now. People watching, encouraging, taking pride in his success as if it were their own. At their building, Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting. "Mijo," she called. "Eduardo got an A on his math test. He says it's because you helped him last weekend." "Just showed him what they taught me at Riverside," Tyrell said. "You showed him more than math," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "You showed him possibilities." In their apartment, Sandra started dinner while Tyrell did his homework at the kitchen table. The train still rattled their windows, but somehow the sound was different now. Less like a reminder of what they couldn't escape, more like the rhythm of progress. "Mom," Tyrell said, looking up from his Latin homework. "Remember what you used to tell me? About keeping my head down?" She stopped stirring the pasta. "Baby Dash, I'm glad I didn't. That day with Mr. Harrison, I'm glad I looked up instead." Sandra wiped her hands and sat across from him. "Me too. But you know what? I was wrong back then. Keeping your head down, that's not living. That's just surviving. And now we're living. Really living." His phone buzzed again. A text from Mr. Harrison. "Check your email. Something you should see." Tyrell opened his laptop, a gift from the school, and found the email. It was a video link. "Mom," he called, "come look at this." The video was from a local news station. The headline read, "Harrison Investment Group launches Youth Leadership Initiative, inspired by Teen Hero." Mr. Harrison's face filled the screen. "One boy's courage changed my life. Now we're going to help other young people change theirs." The camera panned to show a room full of kids in various school uniforms, all holding acceptance letters to top schools. "The Tyrell Johnson Scholarship Fund," Mr. Harrison's voice continued. "Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices." Sandra's hand found Tyrell's shoulder. "That's what you did that day," she whispered. "Started something bigger than yourself." Later that night, Tyrell stood at his window, watching the city lights. His Riverside blazer hung neatly in the closet. His textbooks waited on his desk. Tomorrow's lunch money sat untouched in his drawer. He ate at school now, no more missing meals. A train passed, rattling the glass. But instead of the sound of limitation, now it carried the rhythm of possibility. His phone lit up one last time. "Mr. Harrison again. Proud of you, son. Keep looking up." Tyrell smiled and texted back, "Yes, sir. Always." Because that was the real change, not the school or the uniforms or the opportunities. The real change was learning to look up, to step forward, to cross bridges. Even when those bridges seemed impossible to cross. Even when others said to keep your head down. Even when the whole world was just watching instead of helping. Sometimes all it took was one choice, one moment, one simple question asked on a busy Manhattan street. "Are you well, sir?" And sometimes that question could change everything.